I know we have a lot of sports things, but I'm going to do a shout out for soccer today. Our girls and boys are both in the playoffs. So Georgia Rich girls will play Traveler Road Stadium in Katy tonight to take on the Falcons of Tompkins High School at 7:30. Tickets are $5 at the door. And the Longhorn boys team. This is the first time in Georgia Ranch history the Longhorn boys soccer team will be playing in the playoffs. So we are super pumped and excited over that. They're going to be taking on Seven Lake Spartans at Legacy tonight, and you know Rhodes and Legacy are right side by side within walking distance. $5 at the gate. Let's pack the stands because we are GR. So let's get rowdy. There's plenty of room and it's outdoors, so there's plenty of room to socially distance over there. Also, shout out to my Bells and my Lariat. Tomorrow they have nationals. I know they are going to kill it over there in Galveston. Can't wait to see them. I'll be popping in to check that out. And we also have UIL academic competition tomorrow. So I am super pumped and excited that we are winning on the field and in the classroom for academics and on the dance floor. So I can't wait to see what we bring home. We love you, and remember, if you can't be kind, be quiet.
Softball in that game tonight? Oh. Why? Are you playing Bush? Yeah, probably. Bush only has one varsity baseball team. Literally, we have to send our freshmen to full shirt on Monday. All right, here we go. I guess nobody's coming. Nobody joins. These are actually the days when I lecture and nobody joins. That's kind of disappointing. Makes me sad. Oh well. Do me a favor, just kind of half pay attention at least. And if the little thing pops up that somebody's in the waiting room, let me know. All right. So Monday we did what did we do Monday? World War II. Yes. Yeah. So now we're going to go into the end of World War II. So the end of World War II is really what we call sort of the start of the Cold War. So England is fairly well decimated at the end of World War II, but England has also sort of lost its global standing for a while at this point. They for a long period of time in world history, not this is a world history class, England is like the most dominant country in the world, right? There's the old saying, if y'all ever heard, that the sun never set on the English Empire, right? And what that meant is that literally, no matter what time of the day it was, the sun was shining somewhere that was England, or that was an English territory, right? Whether that was India or Australia or Taiwan or Iraq or the United States or the British Virgin Islands, okay. So the Cold War establishes sort of the dichotomy of two superpowers, right? The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as the two most prominent sort of global forces. And do we know what a Cold War is? Just like a Cold War with a small c? Do you know what that references? Because it's probably important for you to understand that terminology first. So a Cold War means a war in which people are not shooting at one another, right? Like that's sort of the definition of a Cold War. So a hot war then is obviously like World War II. People are dying, right? Like we're killing one another. A Cold War is where we don't kill one another, which on some level is a little misleading because there are skirmishes within the Cold War that are definitely hot. right? Like Korea, Vietnam, and some of those. From the Soviet aspect, you could probably look at Afghanistan as being one of those things conceptually. But really what the Cold War then becomes about, right, and that Cold War sort of with a capital C now, right, talking about like the Cold War, is an ideological conflict between communism and democracy. And communism and democracy cannot coexist. I need you to understand that concept, because the reality is and maybe you'll understand this a little bit better next year. Like Bernie Sanders and his concept of like democratic socialism is kind of an oxymoron. You can't actually have democracy and socialism at the same time. And even the countries that like Bernie sort of emulates for social democracy, or democratic socialism, are really democratic countries with a very large social safety net, which is a little bit different than actual socialism. And so World War II is this ideological conflict over what sort of prominent ideology is going to dominate the globe, right? Whether or not you're going to have democracy or whether or not you're going to have communism. And so the United States and Truman specifically, right? Because with Truman, we have something called the Truman Doctrine. And so the Truman Doctrine is this ideology, this sort of foreign policy belief and behavior, right? Just like we had the Monroe Doctrine that said we're in charge of the Western Hemisphere, right? The Truman Doctrine is the idea that the United States is going to aid any democratic country that is at war with communism. In fact, to this day, well, I don't know about to this day. There was for a long time, I don't know if it's still standing or not, a statue to Harry Truman in Greece. Like the Greeks put up a statue for Harry Truman, right? Because Truman helps Greece fend off a communist revolution. And because ultimately what happens is we have what, and I think it was Churchill who coined the term, we have this iron curtain that comes down, right? And the iron curtain is this idea of obviously you know what a curtain does, right? Right? It prevents you from seeing. Okay? This iron curtain is this idea of something incredibly strong, impenetrable, right? But also it blocks one from another, right? In Berlin, obviously Germany loses World War II. And when Germany finally falls, when Berlin falls, the United States is closing in from the west, right? And the Soviets are closing in from the east. And when they get into Berlin, Berlin ultimately gets split, right? Because Berlin is the capital of Germany. It's in Eastern Germany. Germany as the country gets split as well. You have a West Germany and an East Germany that are created after World War II. West Germany and West Berlin are basically controlled by the United States and their democracies. East Berlin and East Germany are communist, and they are controlled by the Soviet Union, and they're part of the Soviet bloc. And so the Berlin Wall, which holds for 40 years or whatever it is, right? The Berlin Wall becomes this symbol of the Iron Curtain. But the idea here from a US perspective is we engage in what we call a containment policy, right? And we'll have some other terms that get thrown around here as well, like the domino theory. But containment means we are going to try to contain communism to where it is. We do not want communism to spread, okay? Because communism is, at its core, incompatible with American ideologies. It just is. Okay, so the Truman Doctrine, we're going to support free people, right? We are going to make sure that there are no, outside pressures from communist nations that are trying to overcome that. And then the Marshall Plan, and Marshall, his first name was John. I think it was John Marshall. No, it's in my notes. George Marshall. Sorry, excuse me. Was a military officer, was a general during World War II. He becomes Secretary of State. The Marshall Plan is basically to provide economic assistance to these countries, specifically in Europe, in order to allow them to rebuild, right, and not be at risk or threatened by communism and by the Soviet Union. So we're going to provide aid to our European allies who are having to rebuild their country, their infrastructure, once again as a result of the war, right? Again, this is a map of Germany here, and the split between East Germany and West Germany, right? We divide Germany into, again, the sort of democratic allies, United States, England, France, control the West. The Soviets control the East. I told you Berlin, which was the capital of Germany, is obviously split as well. That puts West Berlin, which is democratic, in an area surrounded by communist East Germany. Okay? So we literally have this little pocket of democracy in West Berlin that is surrounded by communism. And in order to aid West Berlin, we have what we call the Berlin Airlift, where we're basically like dropping supplies in via parachute, because with the Iron Curtain, you can't get through, right? Like literally people that were trying to cross the Berlin Wall were being like shot. Okay? And they were being shot from both sides. Like, I need you to understand that, right? Like, if somebody from West Berlin tried to go into East Berlin, they would be shot because the Soviets would think that that was like an attack. If somebody from East Berlin tried to get into West Berlin, the US and the democracy there would probably shoot at them thinking that it's an attack. Although the Soviets would also shoot at them trying to get out because they didn't want people getting out. So, yeah. With the Cold War, we do create something called NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Soviets create their own sort of counter to NATO, which is the Warsaw Pact, named after Warsaw, Poland. But the US is, again, creating this sort of permanent treaty organization aimed solely at defending democratic nations from communism, right? If you pay attention to politics today, NATO is an issue. Yes? Y'all know that? Have you heard about that in the news? Trump railed against NATO all the time because the US, with its massive military and its bloated military budget, constantly aids all sorts of European countries and defends European countries that basically don't spend any money on their own military and don't defend themselves as a result of NATO. Okay? Which is probably unnecessary at this point because, again, NATO was a result of communism, and communism is dead, right? I mean, you've got a couple of South American countries that are trying to be communist or that are communist and are failing miserably. But even China, which is now like the largest communist country in the world, is really not communist anymore. Right? They're really sort of a totalitarian dictatorship. Okay? And they actually have far more free market capitalist ideologies economically because communism fails economically, and it will always fail economically. Communism, y'all understand that? Because I feel like your generation doesn't. Like, I feel like your generation is like, oh, communism is ideal, right? Like seriously, we're raising a whole generation of people that think socialism is the answer. It is not. It has been tried over and over and over and over again, and it has failed over and over and over and over again. The U.S. also will reorganize sort of the military and military intelligence. You had, during World War II, you had what was called the OSS, which was the Office of Strategic Services, which was actually a part of the military that's going to be reimagined as the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency. The reality is what ultimately happens here with some of this realignment and changes is some increase to the bureaucracy as a whole, and some redundancies, and then some issues over like who's talking to whom and who's doing what. The reality is, if you look at sort of the original sort of structure and how they were supposed to play out, the FBI is the intelligence gathering apparatus for domestic America, right? Like what happens within the United States. The CIA is the intelligence gathering apparatus internationally, right? Like globally, in terms of foreign policy. That gets really dicey, especially like now. Like, I mean, when we fast forward to today, like if you have a Syrian refugee, because you know a Syrian refugee just shot up like a supermarket in Colorado, yes? You know that? Okay. I don't know how much y'all pay attention to the news, so. But here's my question then, right? So is that a CIA responsibility or an FBI responsibility? See, it's a complex issue, right? Like, yes, both of them should have been aware, which is probably accurate. Like, honestly, both of them probably should have had some idea. But part of the problem is they also don't talk to one another, right? Like, this is part of the reason why 9/11 is sort of the catastrophe that 9/11 is, right? Because you literally have terrorists, right, that come into the United States via the Canadian border, right? And then they're here, and some of them were actually on the CIA's radar, and then the CIA sort of lost track of them because obviously they shifted and they moved and they took different aliases and whatnot, right? And then you had some of them that were flagged by the FBI, right? But then there's no coordination between the two, and so, out of World War II, we also create Israel as a new nation, right? And this is sort of the, I don't know what the right word is, the world's gift to the Jews as a result of the Holocaust. We create a Jewish state, which had not existed up until this point. Most Jews up until the end of World War II were sort of scattered across Eastern Europe. Or if they were lucky enough prior to World War II to get out of Eastern Europe, they migrated to the United States or tried to figure out some other way to have not ended up in a concentration camp, right? So the creation of Israel as a state is sort of a global gift, right, for the sort of terrible endurance of the Holocaust. Now, obviously, that creates issues that I'm sure you're aware of today, right? Because Palestinians were living there, and now they're sort of kicked out by the rest of the world. Like the rest of the world kind of goes in and just removes them. And when I say the rest of the world, obviously, I mean the United States and its allies. Like Brazil had nothing to do with it. Chile had nothing to do with it. Djibouti, not a part of it. It's a real country, right? Did you know that? Yeah, Djibouti's a real country. Okay, so that brings us to expanding the New Deal. So obviously the New Deal, are you paying attention now, Bert? Now that I'm talking about Djibouti, now you're like, what? Who's Booty? So obviously FDR created the New Deal. Truman was FDR's VP, one of them. Truman had multiple vice presidents, but obviously Truman is FDR's last vice president. And upon FDR's death in sometime in the spring of 45, I forget exactly when, Truman assumes the presidency, right? So Truman is going to take over and become president of the United States. And he is going to look at expanding the New Deal, or look at, how to further our economic goals. Again, World War II brings us out of the Great Depression, but it's not something that just brings us out of it and that's like the end of it and we don't have to think about it or deal with it anymore. So there's a variety of things that happen. I mean, one, Congress establishes the Council of Economic Advisors, which still exists today. There's other sort of congressional behaviors in terms of, labor agreements and whether or not people can join unions, things like that. During the war, and I think we got to talk about this a little bit on Monday, right? Like we had a total war effort. As a part of that, we wanted to make sure that there was not war profiteering going on in the United States, right? And you might understand this conceptually because some of these laws still exist today, right? Like, after Hurricane Harvey, a supermarket couldn't sell bottled water for like $50 a case, right? You know that? And it's called price gouging. And price gouging is illegal, right? Like your Shell gas station on the corner, all of a sudden after Hurricane Harvey, if they're the only ones that still have gas and working pumps, they can't be like, oh, $10 a gallon. Like that's price gouging. Price gouging is illegal in times of an emergency, or it was illegal during World War II. Right? So we basically froze prices across the board. If a loaf of bread, right, or actually let's just say, a pound of flour cost 30 cents in 1941 when the war begins, or 1942 when the war begins, then a pound of flour costs 30 cents in 1945. Now, that's actually problematic economically as well because it doesn't take into account inflation and the actual value of a dollar and all of those things, right? So these are some of the things that Truman is looking to rectify as he takes over, right? How we're going to fix wages, how we're going to fix prices, how we're going to fix labor issues. Again, we now have, our military had been built up to over 10 million people, I think, during World War II, right? So we've got over 10 million service members in uniform during World War II. We don't need a 10 million man army in peacetime. We just don't, right? So after the war, we demilitarize, right? And we basically discharge all kinds of people and send them home back to their civilian life, okay? And so that again creates labor issues, right? Because we talked about how women went to the factories and women now had opportunities, right? So that sort of labor unrest is all a part of what Truman is trying to deal with. Again, just like we talked about sort of opportunities for women in the early 40s as a result of the war, we had opportunities for minorities as well. The 1940s will see sort of what I will refer to as the second Great Migration. Right. So we had the first Great Migration of Blacks out of the South and up into like Chicago and Cleveland and northern factories, right, after industrialization. The end of World War II creates a second mass migration, although this really goes west, right? This goes west to California, and this is where sort of like traditionally Black neighborhoods of Watts and Oakland in California are established and created and begin to thrive as like Black communities, right? Truman does want to see some progress made in terms of civil rights. Truman actually desegregates the military with an executive order, right? We talked about during World War II, you still had Black units and white units, right? And Truman is kind of the idea that this is ridiculous, right? You're all fighting for the same side. You're all on the same side. You should be able to be in the same unit. So he's going to desegregate the military. So there's some significant advancements there, right? Jackie Robinson is obviously another. He breaks the color barrier in professional baseball, playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he begins. It doesn't just break the color barrier for baseball, but he's sort of so prominent and so important, that he's seen as a groundbreaker in a variety of other avenues, right? That Black men are just as capable as white men. That there's not the sort of inherent biological scientific inferiority that had been believed for a long time, right? For a long time. Mexican Americans and civil rights, we'll get a little bit more of that, but you have Cesar Chavez, who's going to try to begin creating, opportunities for Hispanics to unionize in order to try to have some collective bargaining power and work for their own rights. Truman's Fair Deal, right, is his sort of spin on the New Deal. Ultimately, it's unsuccessful. He really can't extend the New Deal because there's still a significant or a fair amount of racial backlash. And so, Truman, like desegregating desegregating the military, and then Truman also prevents like racial discrimination within the hiring of the federal bureaucracy. There's enough backlash from Southern conservatives, and then enough backlash from Republicans who were opposed to the economic ideologies of FDR, that Truman's not really able to further his domestic agenda, right? He sort of lacks the congressional support. That doesn't mean he doesn't pull off sort of a shocking election surprise in 1948. There was a wide-held belief that he wouldn't win, and actually wins relatively easily, right? Like this is an election map from 48 that gives you an idea of sort of how easily he was able to win. And now a part of that in reality is that you do have, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and then you have Strom Thurmond, who runs as well down there in South Carolina, and he gets some of the Southern votes. Strom Thurmond was a very, very prominent politician in America. He's actually elected to the Senate in South Carolina in 1954. Yeah, he becomes a senator for South Carolina in 1954, and Strom Thurmond will serve in the Senate from 1954 until 2002. And as the Truman era progresses, the Cold War begins to warm. Mao Zedong and his communist revolution in China is successful, right? The U.S.-backed sort of Chinese authority is defeated in a communist uprising. And so the United States begins to realize that communism is a huge threat to its allies. And China was, and has always been incredibly important economically. China is a massive market, right? There's literally over 1 billion people that live in China now. And so the inability of China to, or the inability of the United States to trade with China and deal with China economically is actually a pretty significant blow. Atomic weapons, obviously the US had atomic weapons. They utilized 2 during World War II. They actually used 3. They had built 3. They detonated all 3 of them, right? Anybody know where the first one was detonated? The first one was a test, right? And that test actually results in somebody that you know. SpongeBob. You ever seen that cartoon?
Did they drop it in the ocean?
They dropped it in Bikini Bottom, Bikini Atoll, right? So the test, the first nuclear weapons test was on Bikini Atoll, which is a small little chain of islands in the Pacific, right? Because obviously you want to drop it out in the middle of nowhere where, you know, like you don't want to test an atomic weapon in San Francisco, right? Like bad idea. Okay. But yeah, so actually like the people that created SpongeBob, that's kind of a joke that SpongeBob, this like living like mutated sponge, right, is a result of the nuclear detonation at Bikini Atoll. That's why SpongeBob lives in Bikini Bottom. So now you will not watch SpongeBob the same way if you've ever seen that show. Okay. The other 2, we obviously dropped the first one on Hiroshima and the second on Nagasaki. Once that weapon, like once it becomes apparent just how devastating an atomic bomb is, you have an arms race, right? We have a nuclear atomic arms race. And so the Soviets will eventually develop their own atomic bomb. And then for a long time, we operate under this sort of concept of what's referred to as MAD, right? It's an acronym, mutually assured destruction, right? The United States has enough nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union has enough nuclear weapons that if you launch, we launch, and everybody dies. Everybody. Like there are enough nuclear weapons in the world today that you could blow up the planet Earth multiple times over, the entire planet. In the early 50s, war is going to erupt in Korea as a part of this Cold War. Korea begins its own communist revolution. And the U.S. realizes or believes that it must respond. And the Japanese had some influence in Korea. Obviously, as a result of World War II, they lose that influence. Again, if you sort of understand, and I don't know if you can see it on my map back here. Where's my? There it is. Right. This is all Russia. And the Korean Peninsula is this tiny little like dangling piece of land into the Pacific Ocean or the Sea of Japan. I don't think it goes into the actual Pacific Ocean. But Korea is very close to both the Soviet Union and China. And so as the communists begin to overrun that peninsula and push everyone back, the U.S. gets involved, and the U.S. is actually going to intervene. And initially, sort of the belief is that the United States is going to be there just to aid our allies, just to defend democracy. But as the U.S. arrives, they are pushed all the way back to Busan, which is a coastal city, sort of southeast South Korea. And the United States and the democratic allies of Korea control only a minuscule amount of the peninsula. And so the U.S. actually begins an offensive war. Like, they're actually trying to win the Korean War. Eventually, they will actually cross into North Korea and go almost all the way to the Chinese border there. And then that would have gotten into sort of a real issue, because if you had crossed into China, what were you like? Now you might be at war with China. There's definitely reports or beliefs that some of these North Korean soldiers that were in North Korea were not North Koreans, that they were actually Chinese, that the Chinese had sent North Koreans, right? But obviously, if you're fighting them, can you all tell the difference between a Chinese person and a Korean person? Like, if I lined up 3 Canadians and 3 Americans, y'all think you can tell the difference if they didn't speak? Of course not. Right? Like, you didn't really think that we as soldiers in 1954 could have told the difference between a North Korean and a Chinese person on a battlefield? No, of course you can't. Right? There's no way. So maybe the Chinese were directly involved, maybe they weren't. They were definitely supplying the North Koreans. They were definitely providing them with military aid and economic aid and financial aid. But the U.S. Again pushes them all the way back up to the north, and then we're going to negotiate for peace, and that peace creates a ceasefire that actually exists today. Technically, the Korean War is still going on right now, right? We've just had a ceasefire agreement since 1954, I think, 53, right? So that ceasefire is still in agreement today. There's been no actual peace agreement. In fact, the 38th parallel, literally there's like a fence line on the north side of the 38th parallel, and there are North Korean sentries there. And then there's a massive amount of land, a couple football fields wide. And then there's a fence line on the bottom, the southern portion, with South Korean soldiers, and they just sit there and stare at one another. And if you were to like cross the fence line and go into what they call no man's land right there on the 38th parallel, you get shot at from both sides. From both sides. Okay. There you go. So that's just a map of the Korean War, right? So that first one right there, you see that tiny little blue sort of square down there in Southeast Korea. That's all the remaining territory that the U.S. had until they began their offensive push and push back into China, right? Domestically, we have another Red Scare. Again, we're terrified of communism. Right, the House creates this committee on un-American activities. That there's, communist agents in the United States, and there's a communist plot to overthrow the U.S. government. The irrational fear of communism at this time is drastic, and you basically have like that the House Un-American Activities Committee. Is basically just out on a witch hunt. They're calling in all sorts of people. They're making sort of blanket accusations, and it's one of those things that you really like. Like, if I were to call you a communist, how do you prove to me you're not? Can you prove that? You really can't, right? Like, it's one of those things that you actually can't defend yourself for, right? I mean, they'll go after Hollywood the movie industry, that the movie industry is basically run by communists, and that it's sort of communist propaganda. I mean, Hollywood obviously it's not the first time that Hollywood's sort of gotten a bad rap. It certainly won't be the last time, in which people think that Hollywood has some sort of like secret agenda. I mean, the reality is when you look at sort of art like that, art is meant to simply hold up a mirror to society. And it's not like a mirror, it's like a distorted mirror. Like they're showing you, not 100% accurate like depictions of what's going on, but ultimately you had a handful of witnesses that are called before the House that refuse to testify. That are the Hollywood 10, who basically get blackballed from Hollywood, all because they want to exercise their First Amendment rights of freedom of speech. Because believe it or not, part of freedom of speech, a huge part of freedom of speech, is not speaking. Right? The sort of culmination of sort of our fear of communism really goes in with like McCarthy and the McCarthy witch hunts and McCarthyism and his sort of massive endeavor to uncover communism in the United States, which ultimately really just ends up being like a political witch hunt for anybody that was like not aligned with McCarthy. McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin, I believe, if memory serves. But in everything that McCarthy did, there was never any like successful outing of a communist spy within the federal government. He didn't find anybody. I mean, he ruined a lot of people's reputations. He outed homosexuals because, if you were a homosexual at the time, you would be sort of likely to turn, because if the communists found that out about you, then they could use that to like force you to give up secrets, because obviously it's 1950 and everybody's in the closet, right? So, yeah. There was gay people in the closet in the 1950s.
Oh, well, you said everybody.
Yeah, everybody was in the closet in the 1950s. Every gay person was in the closet.
Yeah,
not every human being. Oh, okay, now I see what you're saying. Yes, not every American was in the closet. Every gay American was in the closet. Okay, let's say it that way. Because it wasn't acceptable. Shoot. You go back to psychology, I'm pretty sure in the 1950s, homosexuality was still listed as a psychological disorder, right? Like, oh, you like people of the same sex? You must be crazy. Alger Hiss is sort of the most famous case as it pertains to communism. He's actually found guilty of committing espionage against the United States, because obviously, initially we have atomic weapons, nobody else does. We don't want anybody else to have atomic weapons because atomic weapons are bad, right? But that's even going to go so far as to some increases in nativism and some ideas of trying to decrease immigration, especially Eastern European immigration, because those immigrants might be bringing in sort of communist sympathies and communist ideologies that are adverse to sort of the way of the United States. Ultimately, what we can really get out of the Cold War, we're going to get involved in a variety of skirmishes around the globe in order to try to contain the threat of communism, which we know today is kind of a joke. Like, there is no threat. Like, communism was going to die on its own, and it would have. I mean, no matter what the United States had done, communism would have died on its own. It's not sustainable. Never has been, never will be. But we also see a lot of irrational fear around communism with the Red Scare, and I think it's part of the reason why we have a strong belief in the domino theory. That if Korea fell, then Vietnam would fall, and then if Vietnam fell, then like Thailand is going to fall, and then the Philippines would fall, and then Australia would fall, and then once Australia falls, like, you know, now it's going to come over to the Western Hemisphere, and eventually, like, it'll just be us left against all communist countries, and we'll fall as well, and then the whole world will be communist. Which, you think about it now, and it's asinine, but it was a fairly widely held belief at the time. You know, our Cold War government is, I have a fair amount of sympathy for them. I think they're doing the best they can. But obviously history is not kind to them. Like I said, we sort of know things now that there was no way for them to know at the time, that make a lot of their behaviors and their decisions unnecessary or downright poor. But I think, I really do think that they were doing the best that they could at the given time with the given resources and knowledge that they had. And so ultimately the Cold War is it's a difficult situation that Truman overtakes. I mean, Truman actually gets out of office, and he is one of the least liked presidents in the history of the United States. Like in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower is elected president of the United States. And so in the mid 50s, you know, these presidential polls on Truman and the job Truman did, he had an approval rating down in like the 20s, right? Today, Truman's approval rating is ridiculously high. History has been very good to Truman, again, because he tried the best that he could, and he did engage in a number of activities and a number of policies that were wildly beneficial, right? There were a lot of people that were grossly unhappy with sort of like the Marshall Plan and the idea of the United States aiding Europe and aiding in the rebuild of Europe. But ultimately that was good. It was good for the United States. It created economic opportunity in the United States to be shipping goods and shipping products to England, to Europe. It helped Europe rebuild, and it helped the European democracies have some stability and strength so that they can stand against sort of communist insurrection in their own country. But the Cold War itself ends up being a lot of tension without any real teeth. Like there's not much to it that needs to happen. So, all right, so that's the end of this chapter. Y'all have, what, you have an essay due on Wednesday? Yes? So make sure you get that done. You'll have one short response on Monday. You'll have the essay Wednesday. I think you have another short response the following Monday, and then the test the following Wednesday. All right.